The galaxy had never paid much attention to Earth in the Great Hall of the Galactic conquered, where 1,000 species gathered to decide the fate of star systems. Humanity was little more than a footnote. They had joined the conquered over 100 red years ago in the year 2271, when their first faster than light ship had stumbled into a Chavari trading lane and nearly caused an interstellar incident. Since then they had been given a seat at the table, a small seat near the back where no one important ever looked. The hall itself was a wonder of alien engineering. It floated in open space, a massive ring station orbiting a dead star with walls made of transparent crystal that let the cold light of distant galaxies pour in from every direction. Inside, the representatives of over 600 species sat in tiered rows that rose up like the inside of a bowl. At the bottom in the center stood the speaking platform, a raised circle of white stone where any ambassador could address the entire conquered. Most species ignored humanity's ambassador when she walked to that platform. Lena Vasquez was a tall woman with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing. She had served as Earth's voice in the conquered for 11 years, and in that time she had learned two important things. First, the galaxy was full of species that believed they were better than humans. Second, they were wrong, but today was not a day for proving that. Today was a day for survival. The Velari Empire had sent its ultimatum 3 days ago. The message had arrived on every conquered communication channel at the same time, broadcast in 400 languages, and it said the same thing in all of them: submit or be destroyed. The Velari gave the conquered 30 standard days to respond. After that, their warships would begin moving, and they would not stop until every species in the galaxy bent the knee. The Velari were not making an empty threat. They controlled over 9,000 star systems. Their warships were the largest and most powerful in the known galaxy. Their soldiers were bred for combat, tall, gray-skinned beings with 4 arms and eyes that could see in complete darkness. They had conquered dozens of species over the last 500 years, absorbing them into their empire like a great beast swallowing smaller creatures whole. And now they wanted everything. The conquered had been in a state of panic since the ultimatum arrived. Emergency sessions ran around the clock. Species that had never spoken to each other were suddenly forming desperate alliances. Military leaders from across the galaxy shared intelligence reports that painted a terrifying picture. The Velari throne fleet alone numbered over 3,000 capital ships, each one stretching 12 km from bow to stern. Against that kind of power, most species saw only 2 choices: fight and die, or kneel and alive. One by one they began to kneel. The Dreenth Collective was first. They were a peaceful species of aquatic beings who had no military to speak of. Their ambassador wept as she announced their submission, her translucent body flickering with colors of grief. The Morvathi technocracy followed, then the Pelari Union, then the 10th Dominion. Each announcement landed like a hammer blow on the assembly. Within a week, over 100 species had formally accepted Velari rule. Those who resisted formed a loose coalition, but it was a fragile thing. The Chavari, an insected species with a proud warrior tradition, pledged their fleet. The Tauron, massive stone-like beings who moved slowly but hit like asteroids, offered their ground. forces, a handful of others joined, but everyone knew the truth, even combined. The coalition fleet was less than a tenth the size of the Valari Navy. They were buying time, not building victory. And then there was humanity. Earth's military contribution to the galaxy had always been considered joke. Humans maintained a small defense fleet of about 200 ships, none longer than 3 km. Their technology was considered average at best. They had never fought in a major galactic conflict. When other species thought about humans at all, they thought about their strange foods, their loud music, and their confusing habit of keeping small animals in their homes for emotional comfort. No one expected anything from them. No one even bothered to ask, which was why the hall fell into confused silence when Lena Vasquez walked to the speaking platform on the 15th day after the ultimatum. She stood there for a moment, looking up at the hundreds of faces, some alien beyond description, some almost familiar, and she took a breath. The translation systems hummed, ready to convert her words into every language in the galaxy. Earth declines, she said. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the hall erupted. Species shouted over each other. Translators struggled to keep up with the flood of voices. Some were angry, some were confused, and some were simply laughing. In the upper tiers, where the Valari delegation sat, in their black armor, a deep rumbling sound rose, the Valari equivalent of amusement. The Valari Liet, a decorated commander named Karathan, stood from his seat. He was enormous, even by Valari standards, nearly 3 m tall, with ritual scars running down all 4 of his arms. His voice carried across the hall without any need for amplification. The insects refused the boot, he said. How delightful. Laughter spread through the Valari delegation. Several other species joined in, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the sheer absurdity of what they had just heard. Humanity, with its tiny fleet and its average technology, had just told the most powerful military force in galactic history to go away. Vasquez did not flinch. She did not smile. She simply stood on the platform and waited for the noise to die down. When it did, she spoke again. Earth declines the ultimatum of the Valari Empire. We will not submit. We will not kneel, and we will not explain why. She stepped off the platform and walked back to her seat. The hall buzzed with whispered conversations. The Chavari admiral, a clicking insectoid named Tessith, turned 2 of his compound eyes toward the human section and felt something he could not name. It was not hope. Hope required evidence, and the humans had given none. It was something smaller, curiosity perhaps, or the echo of an old instinct that told him to watch carefully when a small creature refused to run. On Earth, the reaction to Vasquez's speech was mixed. The public had not been told the full truth about the Valari threat. Governments had kept the worst of the intelligence reports classified. Most people knew that something was happening in the galaxy, that there was some kind of political tension, but the full scale of the danger was hidden behind layers of careful messaging. This was not an accident. This was policy. Deep inside the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, in a room that did not appear on any floor plan, a group of 12 people sat around a table and watched Vasquez's speech on a delayed feed. These were the members of the Prometheus Council, a body so secret that most world leaders did not know it. existed, they had been meeting in various forms for over 80 years since the first days of humanity's contact with the galaxy. At the head of the table sat Admiral Reno Vassal. He was 67 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved from old wood and eyes that had seen things he could never talk about. He had spent his entire career in the United Defense Initiative, humanity's true military arm hidden behind the small public fleet that the galaxy was allowed to see. She did well, said one of the council members, a Japanese woman named Dr. Hitomi Tanaka, who oversaw the project's engineering division. Vassal nodded. She always does. The Velari will move soon, said another member. Their fleet deployment suggests they'll begin with the outer reaches. The Shivan corridor is the most likely first target. The coalition forces are already there. Vassal said they'll hold for a week, maybe two, and then Vassal looked at the table. On its surface, a holographic display showed a map of the galaxy. Billions of stars reduced to colored dots, red for Velari territory, blue for conquered space, and they're far from any strategic system. Out in the cold dark beyond Neptune, a single green dot pulsed like a heartbeat. Then we wake it up, he said. 6 hours later, an encrypted signal left Earth. It traveled through a series of hidden relay stations, devices no bigger than a basketball floating in the emptiness between stars, undetectable by any known sensor technology. The signal bounced from relay to relay, crossing billions of kilometers in a matter of minutes until it reached the outer edge of the solar system, past Neptune, past the scattered disk of icy bodies that marked the boundary of the sun's influence, out into the true dark where the sun was just another star among millions. There, drifting in the black, was a rogue planetoid. It had no official name. In the classified files of the Prometheus Council, it was called Black Cradle. It was roughly the size of a small moon, its surface covered in ancient ice and dust. To any passing sensor, it looked like a dead rock. Unremarkable, uninteresting, invisible. Beneath its surface, the signal arrived. Deep underground in a command center. Carved from solid rock, a screen lit up. The message was short, just 2 words, followed by an authorization code that had never been used before. Prometheus. Wake. For a long moment nothing happened, then slowly lights began to turn on. Not small lights, not the gentle glow of a computer screen or a control panel. These were lights that stretched for kilometers, vast strips of illumination running along walls that rose higher than any building on Earth. They revealed a cavern so large that it had its own weather systems, its own air currents, its own gravity variations. And in the center of that cavern, filling it almost completely, was a ship. It was difficult for the human mind to understand the size of it. The brain tried to process what the eyes were seeing and simply failed. It was not a ship in the way that a person normally thought about ships. It was more like a landscape, a thing so vast that it had horizons. Its hull stretched 214 km from bow to stern. Its widest point was over 40 km across. It was larger than most asteroids. It was larger than some moons. The UES Prometheus had been humanity's greatest secret for 80 years. 3 generations of engineers, scientists, workers, and soldiers had lived and died inside Black Cradle, building this impossible thing. They had mined asteroids in secret, developed Technologies that the galaxy did not know existed, and constructed a vessel that broke every rule of known engineering. Many of them had never left. Many of them were buried in the rock beneath the ship they had spent their lives creating. They had done all of this in silence, no leaks, no whispers, no hints. Every person who worked on the Prometheus understood that the secret was more important than their own life. They accepted this not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in it. They believed that one day the galaxy would threaten everything humanity had built, and on that day, Earth would need an answer. That day had come. Across the length of the ship, systems that had been dormant for years began to activate. Reactors powered up, their cores burning with energy sources that no galactic species had ever weaponized. Sensors unfolded like the petals of enormous flowers. In the ship's vast hangar bays, rows of fighters and drones sat in perfect lines, waiting for pilots and commands that were now on their way. The docking clamps that held the Prometheus in place were each the size of a city block. One by one they began to release. The sound of metal separating from metal echoed through black cradle like thunder, shaking dust from walls that had not moved in decades. On the bridge, a space so large that it needed its own internal transport system. The main display flickered to life. It showed the stars outside, visible through sensors that could see through solid rock. The galaxy spread out in every direction, beautiful and cold and full of danger. Admiral Vassal's voice came through the communication system, transmitted from Earth across the chain of hidden relays. Prometheus, this is Overwatch confirmed. Status, a young officer named Lieutenant Cade, who had been born inside black cradle and had never seen a natural sky, pressed his hand to the console and replied with a voice that shook only slightly. Overwatch, this is Prometheus. All systems nominal. The ship is awake. Back on Earth, Vassal closed his eyes for a moment. 80 years, 3 generations, trillions of dollars, millions of lives, dedicated to a single purpose. And now, in a cavern at the edge of the solar system, the product of all that sacrifice was opening its eyes for the first time. He opened his eyes and looked at the council. Send the crew, he said, and get me Captain Ock. Far away, past the light of familiar stars, the Velari war machine was already moving. Thousands of warships were forming into attack fleets, their commanders eager and confident. They had conquered species far more advanced than human. They had shattered alliances that had stood for millennia. They had never lost a war. They did not know what was waiting for them in the dark, and that, as humanity had always understood, was exactly the point. In the great hall of the Galactic conquered, Liat Kion finished his third drink and laughed again at the memory of the human ambassador's words. Earth declines. What a wonderful joke. He would have to remember to tell it to his soldiers before they burned humanity's little fleet to ash. He looked out through the crystal walls at the stars and felt the warm certainty of a predator that had never met anything it could not kill. He did not notice the Chavari admiral watching him from across the hall. Tessith's compound eyes reflected the starlight in 1,000 tiny points, and something old and quiet stirred in his warrior's heart. He had seen many species face destruction. He had seen them rage and weep and beg. He had never seen one smile the way the human Ambassador had smiled as she walked back. To her seat, it was a small smile. Barely there, the kind of smile a person wore when they knew something no one else in the room knew. Tessith had fought in enough wars to recognize that smile. It was the smile of someone holding a loaded weapon beneath the table. He clicked his mandibles quietly and turned back to the stars. Whatever the humans were planning, he thought it was either the bravest thing he had ever seen or the most foolish, he suspected, with a feeling he could not explain that. It was both. Captain Sorenok had been waiting for this call his entire life. He was sitting in his apartment in Logos when the message arrived, not on his personal communicator, not through any normal channel, but through a device hidden inside a hollowed-out book on his shelf. The book was a copy of Things Fall Apart by Chinua 8. It had been given to him by his father, who had received it from his grandmother, who had been one of the first engineers assigned to the Prometheus project 90 years ago. The device inside the book had never made a sound before. 3 generations of the Achaik family had carried it, passed it down like a sacred relic, always knowing what it meant and praying it would never activate. When it beeped a single soft tone, Soren sat down his cup of tea and stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up the book, opened it, and read the message on the small screen embedded in its pages. Prometheus. Active report to Blacka. You have command. He closed the book. He looked around his apartment at the photographs on the wall, the plants by the window, the half-finished puzzle on his kitchen table. He looked at these things the way a man looks at a life he is about to leave behind. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked out the door. 12 hours later, he was aboard a transport shuttle that did not officially exist, traveling on a flight path that appeared on no navigation chart, heading for a destination that the galaxy did not know was there. With him were 47 other officers, all of them drawn from the secret ranks of the United Defense Initiative. They were the command staff of the Prometheus people, who had trained for years in hidden facilities on Earth and Mars, running simulations of a ship they had never actually seen. When the shuttle entered Black Cradle through a concealed tunnel in the planetoid southern pole, Soren pressed his face to the viewport and watched the ice walls slide past. Tunnel was wide enough to fly a battle cruiser through, and it descended for over 60 km before opening into the main cavern. He had studied the specifications, he had memorized the dimensions, he had seen holographic models and technical drawings and high-resolution photographs taken by maintenance drones. None of it had prepared him for the reality. The Prometheus filled the cavern like a god sleeping in a temple. Its hull was dark, not painted dark, but made of a material that seemed to drink in light, giving the ship an appearance of incredible density, as if it were made of compressed night. Running along its length were lines of faint blue illumination, like veins carrying luminous blood. The ship's bow curved forward into a shape that was both elegant and aggressive, like the head of some deep ocean predator. Near the stern, enormous engine housings jutted outward, each one large enough to contain a small city. Soren realized he had stopped breathing. He forced himself to inhale. There she is, said Commander Yuki Tanaka, his executive officer, who was sitting beside him. She was the granddaughter of Dr. Hitomi Tanaka, the engineer who sat on the Prometheus. Counsel, like Soren, she had inherited. Her role along with a family secret, 214 km of humanity's best kept secret. It's bigger than I imagined, Soren said. Quietly, everyone says that the shuttle docked at one of the ship's portside entry bays. Even the docking bay was enormous, a space large enough to hold several conventional warships. Crews were already moving through it, loading supplies and equipment onto transport carts that would carry them deep into the ship's interior. The Prometheus was being brought to full operational status for the first time in its existence, and the process required the coordinated effort of tens of thousands of people. Soren stepped off the shuttle and onto the deck of his ship. He stood there for a moment, feeling the subtle vibration of the reactors through the soles of his boots, and allowed himself one moment of pure wonder before the weight of command settled onto his shoulders. The full crew complement would be 85,000 personnel. They were arriving in waves, shuttles launching from hidden bases on Earth, Mars, Europa, and Titan, each one carrying specialists who had spent their careers preparing for deployment they hoped would never come. Fighter pilots, drone operators, engineers, medical staff, weapons technicians, intelligence analysts, cooks, cleaners, and counselors. It took a small civilization to run a ship this size, and that was exactly what the Prometheus carried, a civilization with a single purpose. Over the next 48 hours, Soren walked the ship. This was tradition. The first captain of a vessel was expected to know her from bow to stern, but on the Prometheus, it was more like a pilgrimage. He rode internal transport pods through corridors that stretched for kilometers. He visited the reactor complex where 12 fusion cores burned with a steady blue light, each one producing more energy than most species. Entire planetary grids. He walked through the agricultural decks where automated farms grew food under artificial sunlight, enough to feed the crew for years without resupply. He visited the hangar bays. There were 20 of them arranged along the ship's flanks like the chambers of an enormous heart. Inside each one, rows of strike fighters sat in perfect formation. Sleek, angular craft painted in flat black, designed for speed and precision. Between the fighter rows, the drones waited, thousands of them. They were smaller than the manned fighters, each one controlled by an AI system that could process tactical data faster than any living pilot. In total, the Prometheus carried 14,000 combat drones and 2,200 manned fighters. It was by any measure the most powerful military force ever assembled by a single species, and the galaxy had no idea it existed. Soren ended his tour on the bridge. It was located deep inside the ship's core, protected by hundreds of meters of armor and shielding on every side. The bridge itself was a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time image of whatever was outside the ship. Currently, the ice walls of black cradle workstations were arranged in concentric rings, rising in tiers toward the outer walls, each one staffed by officers who were still familiarizing themselves with systems they had only ever used in simulation. At the center of the bridge was the captain's chair. It was a simple thing. No gold trim, no elaborate design, just a well-built seat with integrated controls and a direct neural link to the ship's main computer. Soren sat down in it and felt the link activate, sending a tingle up his spine as the ship systems connected to his thoughts for a brief, overwhelming moment. He could feel the entire ship, all 214 km of it, every corridor, every compartment, every reactor and weapon and sensor array. The Prometheus was not just large. It was alive in the way that only a ship crewed by 85,000 souls could be. Status report. He said. Commander Tanaka, who had taken her station to his right, pulled up the data. All primary systems are online. Reactor output is at 92% and climbing. Weapon systems are in standby. The cloak is ready. The cloak that was the single most important piece of technology on the ship, and the reason the Prometheus had remained hidden for 80 years. The galaxy used various forms of stealth technology: sensor dampening, signal absorption, electromagnetic masking. All of them had limits. All of them could be defeated with sufficiently advanced detection equipment. The Prometheus used something different. Its engineers had called it gravitation refraction cloaking, but that name barely described what it actually did. The system bent gravity itself around the ship, creating a bubble of distort spacum that caused light, radiation, and sensor waves to flow around the vessel like water flowing around a stone in a stream. Inside the bubble, the ship was invisible, not just hard to detect, but genuinely invisible to the outside universe. The space where the Prometheus sat appeared completely empty. No other species in the galaxy had this technology. Most did not even believe it was theoretically possible. Human physicists had discovered the principles behind it almost a century ago, and the Prometheus Council had made the decision to keep it secret rather than share it with the conquered. It was humanity's ace in the hole, the one advantage that could not be countered because no one knew it existed. Navigation, Soren said. Plot a course for the Shivang corridor. The navigation officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Park, looked up from her station. Sir, that's deep in contested space. Velari forward fleet is already there. I know, Soren said. That's why we're going. The intelligence reports had been arriving steadily since the Prometheus came online. The Velari had begun their offensive exactly as predicted, striking first at the SH-Ven corridor, a strategically vital star system that served as a gateway between the galactic core and the outer territories. A coalition fleet of 5 allied species had gathered there to make a stand, led by the Chavari Admiral Tassith. The coalition had assembled about 300 warships. It was the largest combined fleet the conquered had ever formed. Under different circumstances, it might have been an impressive display of unity against the 400 Velari warships that were now bearing down on the corridor. It was a death sentence. Admiral Vassal's orders had been clear. The Prometheus would go to the Shivan corridor, break the Velari assault, and announce humanity's true capabilities to the galaxy. The element of surprise was everything. The Velari could not prepare for a weapon they did not know existed. The departure from Black Cradle was a process that took 6 hours. The docking clamps released one by one, each separation sending vibrations through the hull that the crew could feel in their bones. The ship's engines ignited, not with a roar but with a deep, subsonic hum that seemed to resonate with something primal in the human chest. Slowly, impossibly slowly, for something so massive, the Prometheus began to move. It glided through the cavern and into the exit tunnel, its hull clearing the ice walls by less than a kilometer on each side. Navigation required absolute precision. A ship this size could not afford even a small error. In a space this confined, Lieutenant Park guided them through with steady hands and a racing heart, and when they emerged from the tunnel into open space, the bridge crew released a collective breath. The stars greeted them cold, ancient, indifferent. The sun was a bright dot far away, no more significant than any other star in the sky. Activate the cloak, Soren ordered. The gravitational refraction system engaged. On the bridge display, nothing visible changed. The ship looked the same from inside the bubble, but Soren could feel it through the neural link, a subtle shift in the way the universe pressed against the hull, as if reality itself had agreed to look the other way. The Prometheus vanished from the universe's sight and began its journey. It took 3 days to reach the Shivan corridor at maximum speed, 3 days of preparation, drilling, and quiet tension. The crew ran combat simulations around the clock. Fighter pilots sat in their cockpits and rehearsed launch sequences. Drone operators tested their neural interfaces, each one capable of controlling dozens of unmanned craft simultaneously. Weapons officers ran diagnostic after diagnostic on the ship's vast arsenal, and deep in the ship's core, behind doors that required 3 separate authorization codes to open, the weapons team performed final checks on Elginus. Elginus was the Prometheus's primary weapon, a spinal-mounted cannon that ran nearly the entire length of the ship's central axis. It did not fire conventional munitions. It did not fire energy beams. Elginus compressed matter into a micro-singularity, a point of gravity so intense that it mimicked a tiny black hole, and then accelerated it to near light speed along a magnetic rail that stretched for over 100 km. The result was a projectile that could not be stopped by any known shield technology. When it hit something, it did not explode. It consumed everything within several kilometers of the impact point, was pulled inward, crushed, and destroyed against a fleet formation. The effect was devastating. The singularity would tear through multiple ships before dissipating, leaving nothing but scattered atoms in its wake. Elginus had never been fired outside of controlled testing. The weapons team handled its systems with the careful reverence of people who understood that they were maintaining something terrible. On the evening of the 3rd day, the Prometheus arrived at the Shivan corridor. The corridor was a region of space defined by 2 massive nebula, walls of gas and dust that created a natural channel between star systems. It was beautiful in a cold way. Swirls of purple and blue light painting the darkness like strokes from a cosmic brush through the center of the corridor. The coalition fleet was arrayed in a defensive formation. Soren studied the tactical display and felt his stomach tight. The coalition was in bad shape. Their ships were a mismatched collection, Chavari cruisers with their angular, insectoid design, Tauron dreadnoughts that looked like flying mountains, fast attack frigates from the Pelari Union, and various other vessels from species that had pledged whatever they could spare. They were brave. They were determined. They were hopelessly outgunned. On the far side of the corridor, the Velari fleet was approaching in perfect formation, 400 warships, each one a dark gray wedge bristling with weapon ports. At their center, the Velari command ship dwarfed everything around it, a 12 km behemoth that served as the mobile headquarters of War Prince Aethel, one of the Empire's most decorated military commanders. Aethel had won 43 campaigns. He had never lost a battle. He had personally overseen the subjugation of 6 species, and he approached each new conquest with the calm efficiency of a craftsman, performing familiar work. The coalition fleet was an inconvenience, nothing more. He expected the battle to last less than 2 hours. The coalition knew this. Admiral Tessith stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Chavari vessel Eternal Wing, and watched the approaching Velari fleet with all 6 of his eyes. His compound gaze could track hundreds of individual contacts simultaneously, and each one was a death warrant for the beings under his command. He had already composed his death poem, a Chavari tradition for commanders who expected to fall in battle. It was a short poem, as was proper. It spoke of duty and starlight and the honor of standing firm. He had transmitted it to the Chavari home world an hour ago. Around him, his bridge officers worked their stations with the focus of professionals who had accepted their fate. Communications channels buzzed with final messages, soldiers saying goodbye to families, captains encouraging their crews, species that had been strangers a month ago now, calling each other brothers and sisters in arms. It was Tesk thought a beautiful and terrible thing. Admiral, his censor officer, said Theory Fleet will be in weapons range in 18 minutes. Teskith clicked his mandibles in acknowledgement. All ships prepare for engagement. Today we show the galaxy what courage looks like, even in defeat. He did not know that 20 km above his flagship, invisible and silent, the largest warship ever built by any species, was watching everything. On the Prometheus's bridge, Saranac leaned forward in his chair. The neural link fed him data from every sensor on the ship, the positions of every vessel, the energy signatures of every weapon, the communication traffic from both fleets. He could feel the fear in the coalition's transmissions and the cold confidence in the Velaris. All departments report combat readiness. Commander Tanaka said, fighter wings. All 2,200 pilots are in their cockpits, ready for launch. Drone swarms. 14,000 units standing by. AI coordination is nominal. L-Gininus. A pause, then from the weapon station. Charged and ready. Captain Soren looked at the tactical display one more time. The Velari fleet was closing in. In 15 minutes they would open fire on the coalition, and the slaughter would begin. 300 ships crewed by beings who had chosen to fight rather than kneel, about to be ground to dust by an empire that saw them as nothing more than obstacles. Not today, Soren thought. "Ugh. Hands," he said, his voice carrying through every speaker on the ship, reaching 85,000 people across 214 km of hull. "This is Captain Ock. In a few minutes we are going to do something that has never been done before. We are going to show the galaxy who we are. I know many of you are afraid. I am afraid too, but we are here because our parents built this ship and their parents before them, and we will not let their sacrifice be wasted. Do your duty, trust your training, and remember the whole galaxy is about to find out that they should never have underestimated humanity." He took a breath, dropped the cloak. Gravitational refraction system disengaged. The bubble of bent spacetime collapsed, and in a single instant the Prometheus appeared in the Shivan corridor. 214 km of dark hall and blue light, larger than anything any species had ever built, hanging in space like a judgment from a god that no one had believed in. Every sensor in the corridor screamed. On the bridge of the eternal wing, Admiral Tessith's death poem dissolved in his mind like smoke in a wind. His compound eyes widened until they arced, his mandibles fell open. Around him, his bridge crew froze, staring at their displays with the paralyzed disbelief of beings whose entire understanding of the universe had just been shattered. The sensor officer spoke in a whisper, "Admiral, it's 200 km long." Tessith said nothing. He could not speak. He could only stare at the impossible thing that had appeared above his fleet. And in the deepest part of his warrior's soul, he felt the first spark of something he had not felt in a very long time. Hoping on the other side of the corridor, aboard the Velari command ship, Warp, Prince Aethel received the sensor data and experienced an emotion that his species had nearly evolved out of. Fear. Warp Prince Aethel stared at his tactical display and refused to believe what it was showing him. He had conquered 6 species. He had burned worlds. He had stood on the bridges of enemy flagships and watched their commanders beg for mercy. In 43 campaigns spanning 2 centuries of service to the Velari Empire, he had never once encountered something he could not understand. Until now, the object that had appeared in the Shivan corridor defied every principle of military engineering he had ever studied. No species built ships that size. It was not practical. It was not possible. The material requirements alone would bankrupt most civilizations. And the energy needed to move something that massive through space exceeded the output of entire planetary systems. And yet there it was, 214 km of impossible, hanging in the void like a dark blade laid across the stars. "Confirm the sensor reading," Aethel said. His voice was calm. A Velari Warp Prince did not show fear, not even to himself. His sensor officer, a young Velari with fresh scars on only 2 of his arms, ran the scan again and again, and a third time each reading returned the same result. "Confirmed, War Prince, single vessel length 214 kilometers, mass is beyond our sensor calibration. Origin," he paused, "origin is human." Human, the word hung in the air like poison around the bridge. Officers exchanged looks that they would later deny. Humans, the small soft creatures from the wet planet, the ones who kept animals in their homes and cried at fictional stories, the ones that Liet Chathon had called insects. Those humans had just put the largest warship in galactic history directly in the path of his fleet, open a channel to all ships. Aethel commanded he would not show uncertainty. Uncertainty was a disease that could spread through fleet faster than any weapon. All commands. This is the Warp Prince. Humans have deployed a single vessel of unusual size. It changes nothing. Our objective remains the destruction of the coalition fleet. Maintain formation and prepare to engage. He believed this. He had to believe. This size was not everything in naval warfare. A large ship was a large target. The Velari had weapons designed to crack planets. Surely they could handle one oversized human vessel. No matter how impressive it looked, but deep in the part of his mind that had kept him alive through 43 campaigns. A small voice whispered something he did not want to hear. It whispered if they could build it, what else could they build? He silenced the voice and ordered the advance on the Prometheus. Captain Soren Ake watched the Velari fleet begin to move and felt the calm that came before all great storms. They're not retreating, Commander. Tanaka observed. I didn't expect them to. Soren said, the Velari have never faced something they couldn't beat. They don't know how to back down. Then we'll have to teach them. Soren nodded. He opened the shipwide channel. All wings launch. The Prometheus had 20 hangar bays, 10 on each flank. When they opened simultaneously, the effect was like watching a living thing exhale. Fighters poured out in streams of black and silver, each one accelerating to combat speed within seconds of clearing the bay. Behind them came the drones, smaller, faster, moving in swarms that shifted and flowed like schools of fish. 2,200 manned fighters, 14,000 drones. Together they formed a combat cloud that spread across the corridor in a matter of minutes, filling the space between the Prometheus and the approaching Velari fleet with a living wall of metal and fire. The Velari had excellent sensors. They counted the fighters, they counted the drones, they calculated the numbers and compared them to their own forces. The math was not in their favor, but the Velari did not fight wars based on math alone. They fought based on superiority, technological, tactical, and psychological. They had always been superior. War Prince Aethel gave the order to attack. The Velari fleet opened fire at maximum range. Energy beams lanced across the corridor, brilliant lines of white-hot plasma that could cut through conventional hull armor like a knife through paper. Each Velari warship carried dozens of heavy weapons, and 400 ships firing together created a wall of destruction that would have been the end of any fleet in galactic history. The human drones moved. It was not like anything the Velari had seen before. Conventional drone tactics were simple. Swarm the enemy, overwhelm their point. Defense, sacrifice units to create openings for manned ships. Every species used drones this way because it was effective and because drone AI was generally limited to basic pattern execution. Human drone AI was not limited. The 14,000 drones reorganized in an instant, splitting into fractal formations, patterns within patterns within patterns, each one adapting in real time to the trajectory of incoming fire. They did not simply dodge, they anticipated. The AI systems controlling them processed the firing patterns of every Velari weapon, predicted where the next shots would land, and moved the drones out of the way before the beams even left their cannons. The Velari first volley, which should have destroyed thousands of targets, hit almost nothing. Aethel watched the tactical display and felt something cold settle in his chest. That was not possible. Drone AI did not work that way. It could not work that way. The processing power required to predict and counter 400 ships' worth of weapon fire simultaneously was beyond anything in the Galactic Technological Index. Recalculate firing solutions, he ordered. Switch to scatter patterns. The Velari shifted tactics, abandoning precision fire in favor of wide area saturation. Instead of aiming at specific targets, they filled entire regions of space with overlapping fields of plasma. It was wasteful, but it should have been effective against a swarm. The drones adapted again. Fractal formations compressed, the swarms flowing through the gaps between saturation zones like water, finding cracks in a wall. Some drones were hit. Dozens, then hundreds, but the losses were a fraction of what the Velari expected, and for every drone that died, the AI learned something new about Velari firing patterns and shared that knowledge with every surviving unit. Milliseconds. The swarm was learning faster than the Velari could adapt. Now Soren said, "Fighter wings engage." The human pilots had been waiting behind the drone screen, watching the Velari exhaust their long-range batteries on targets that refused to die. Now they surged forward, riding in the wake of the drone formations, using the swarm as cover to close the distance. Human fighters were not the most heavily armed ships in the galaxy. They were not the most heavily armored, but they were fast, and their pilots were trained to a standard that bordered on obsession. Every pilot on the Prometheus had spent thousands of hours in simulation fighting against AI models of tactics. They knew how Velari ships moved. They knew how Velari shields cycled, and they knew something that no other species had ever figured out. Velari shields had a cycling gap. Every energy shield in the galaxy operated on a refresh cycle, a brief moment when the shield dropped to a lower power state before recharging. For most species shields, this gap was so small that it was meaningless in combat. But the Velari, in their confidence that no enemy would ever get close enough to exploit it, had designed their shields with a cycling gap of 3 seconds. 3 seconds was an eternity for a human pilot flying at combat speed with a assisted targeting. The first Velari warship to fall was a heavy cruiser on the fleet's left flank. A wing of 12 human fighters dove toward it in a coordinated attack, their weapons silent until the exact moment the ship's shields dipped. Then they fired 12 precision strikes, hitting the same section of hull in a window of less than a third of a second. The shots punched through the armor, reached the reactor, and the cruiser detonated in a flash of blue-white light. The second ship fell 7 seconds later, then the third, then 2 more at the same time. On the Velari command ship, alarms were sounding. Damage reports flooded in from across the fleet. Ships that had stood unbreakable against every enemy the Empire had ever faced were being picked apart by small craft that seemed to know exactly where and when to strike. They know our shield frequency, Athel's weapons officer said, his voice tight with disbelief. Their timing, their attacks to the cycling gap, that's impossible. No species has ever cataloged our shield cycles with respect. War prints they clearly have. Athel's 4 hands gripped the arms of his command chair. The humans had been studying them for years, probably decades. The humans had been watching Velari ships, analyzing their technology, learning their vulnerabilities, all while pretending to be a harmless backwater species with nothing to offer the galaxy. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had not been hiding because they were weak. They had been hiding because they were preparing. The battle raged across the corridor. The Velari were still dangerous, immensely so. Their weapons tore through human fighters and drones with terrible efficiency when they connected. Soren watched the casualty reports climb on his display and felt each number like a wound. These were his people. Every pilot who died, every drone operator who lost their link. Every fighter that exploded in the vacuum, they were all his responsibility. But the tide was turning. The fractal drone formations had penetrated deep into the Velari formation, and the human fighters were exploiting the chaos. Velari warships were being engaged from multiple directions at once. Their captains forced to divide their attention between threats that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. On the far side of the battlefield, the coalition fleet watched in stunned silence. Admiral Tessith had ordered his ships to hold position, not because he was a coward, but because he genuinely did not know what to do. The battle unfolding before him was unlike anything in his experience. The humans were not fighting like any species he had ever seen. They were fighting like a force of nature, adaptive, relentless, and impossible to predict. Should we engage, Admiral? His tactical officer asked. Tessith considered it. His ships were battered and many were low on ammunition, but they could still fight. They could add their firepower to the human assault and help finish the Velari fleet. No, he said quietly, not yet. Let us see what these humans can truly do. What the humans could truly do became clear in the next 30 minutes. The Velari fleet, battered and bleeding, was still fighting. Aethel had lost over 100 ships, but he had nearly 300 remaining, and they were regrouping. The War Prince was adapting, pulling his fleet into a tight defensive sphere, overlapping shield coverage to eliminate the cycling gaps, concentrating fire to create kill zones that even the human drones could not navigate safely. It was a good tactic against any other enemy. It might have worked, but Aethel was trying to solve a problem with conventional thinking, and there was nothing conventional about the Prometheus. He's consolidating, Soren observed, studying the Velari formation. The defensive sphere was strong. Attacking it directly would cost him fighters he could not afford to lose. He's learning. Tanaka agreed. Another hour and he might actually figure out a counter to the drones. He won't get another hour, Soren said. He touched the neural link and felt the vast bulk of the Prometheus respond. The ship had been holding position since the battle began, letting its fighters and drones do the work. Now, for the first time, it began to move. 214 kilometers of warship gliding forward through the debris of battle. Silent and massive, its blue-lit hull reflected in the burning wreckage of dead ships on every surviving Velari vessel. Sensors registered the movement, and crews felt their courage waver. They had been fighting the human small craft. They had almost forgotten about the monster behind them. Aethel watched the Prometheus approach and made his decision. He was a war prince of the Velari Empire. He had never retreated. He would not begin now. All ships, he broadcast, form spearhead. Target the human vessel full speed. Ahead. It was a brave order. It was also, in retrospect, a mistake. The remaining Velari fleet, 260 ships, reformed into an attack wedge aimed directly at the Prometheus. They accelerated to maximum combat speed, their weapons charging for a concentrated volley that would hit the human ship with the combined firepower of an armada. The plan was to close the distance quickly, deliver an overwhelming strike to a single point on the hull, and hope that even a ship that size could not survive concentrated fire from hundreds of capital ships. They were still 40,000 km away when Soren gave the order. Elginenus, he said, fire. Deep in the core of the Prometheus, the spinal weapon activated, a compressed micro-singularity formed at the base of the 100-kilometer magnetic rail and was accelerated to 97% of the speed of light. The ship shuddered not from recoil but from the distortion of space-time around the projectile as it left the barrel. The Velari never saw it coming. Elginina struck the center of the spearhead formation. The micro-singularity punched through the first ship without slowing, consuming it so completely that nothing remained, not even debris. It hit the second ship and the third and the fourth. Each impact destabilized the singularity slightly, but not enough to stop it. The projectile tore through the heart of the Velari formation in a straight line, destroying everything in its path. 83. Ship ceased to exist in less than 2 seconds. The gravitational wake of the singularity reached outward from the line of destruction, pulling at nearby ships. Reactors that were already stressed from combat could not handle the additional gravitational strain. Dozens of vessels experienced cascading failures, containment breaches, structural collapses, catastrophic detonations. The spearhead formation, which had been the concentrated might of a galactic superpower, disintegrated into an expanding cloud of fire and shattered metal. On the Velari command ship, which had survived only because it was at the rear of the formation warp, Prince Aethel stood in the center of a bridge filled with screaming alarms and flickering lights and watched the death of his fleet on the tactical display. More than half his remaining ships were gone. The rest were scattered, their formations broken, their crews in shock. He was a warrior. He had accepted the possibility of death before every battle he had ever fought, but this was not death in battle. This was a roar. The humans had not just beaten his fleet. They had demonstrated that the Velari's entire military doctrine, the foundation of their empire's power, was obsolete. War Prince, his communications officer, said, voice shaking, surviving ships are requesting permission to withdraw. Aethel looked at the display one final time. The Prometheus loomed there, impossibly vast, its hull unmarked. It had ended the battle without taking a single hit from a capital ship weapon. He closed his 4 eyes. When he opened them, they held something that no one on his bridge had ever seen in them before. Acceptance. All ships, he said, retreat maximum speed, head for Imperial space. Surviving Velari ships, fewer than 100, now turned and ran. They scattered in every direction, their captains pushing their engines beyond safe limits, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the dark giant that had destroyed their fleet. The Prometheus did not pursue. On the bridge, Soren leaned back in his chair and let out a long, shaking breath. Neural link was flooding him with data. Damage reports from his own forces, casualty counts, status updates from every squadron. They had lost fighters. They had lost drones. They had lost people, but they had one commander. Tanaka turned to him with eyes that were bright with tears she would not shed. On duty, Captain. The Velari are in full retreat. The Shivan corridor is secure. Soren nodded. He wanted to feel triumph, but what he felt instead was the heavy, complicated weight of what they had just done. They had revealed themselves. The secret that 3 generations had kept was now known to every species with a sensor array pointed at this corridor. There was no going back. Open a channel to the Coalition fleet, he said. The channel Opened, for a moment there was only silent, the silence of hundreds of ships crewed by beings who were still trying to process what they had witnessed. Then Admiral Tessith's voice came through. The old Chavari warrior sounded different than he had in any transmission before. He sounded young. Human vessel, he said, this is Admiral Tessith of the Chavari warship Eternal Wing. I do not have words sufficient for what you have done today. He paused. My people composed death poems before battles we do not expect to survive. I composed mine this morning because of you. I will not need it. Soren smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. Admiral Tessith, this is Captain Akov. The UE Prometheus. It's good to meet you. I'm glad you won't be needing that poem. Across the corridor on every surviving ship, crews were cheering, weeping, embracing each other. Species that had prepared to die were suddenly impossibly alive. The Velari had been beaten, not just stopped, shattered. Force that the entire galaxy believed to be invincible had been broken by single ship from a species that everyone had dismissed as irrelevant. The battle data would spread across the galaxy within hours. Every species, every government, every military command would receive the sensor logs and see the same impossible thing, a human ship, 214 km long, appearing from nowhere and destroying the most powerful fleet in the known galaxy. Nothing would be the same after this. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Soren allowed himself one more moment of quiet. Then he straightened in his chair and looked at the stars ahead. Set course for the next Velari fleet. Concentration, he said. The war isn't over yet. The Prometheus turned slow and massive, its blue-lit hull catching the light of distant stars, and it moved forward into the galaxy like a promise or a warning written in steel. And silence behind them in the wreckage of the shivering corridor. Admiral Tessith sat alone on his bridge and tore his death poem into small pieces. He would not need it today, perhaps not ever. Insects, it seemed, had brought a very large boot of their own. The galaxy did not sleep the night after the battle of the Shivan corridor. On 1,000 worlds across hundreds of species, beings stayed awake and stared at screens showing the same data. A ship, a human ship, 214 km long. It had appeared from nothing, destroyed 400 Velari warships, and was now moving deeper into contested space with the calm deliberation of a predator that knew it had no natural enemies. The Galactic conquered. Communication networks were overwhelmed within hours. Every ambassador, every military commander, every intelligence agency in the galaxy was trying to understand the same thing. How had humans of all species, built something like this without anyone noticing? The answer, which would take years for galactic analysts to fully accept, was simple. No one had been looking. Humanity had been so thoroughly dismissed, so completely written off as a minor species with nothing to offer, that no one had ever bothered to monitor them closely. The galaxy's greatest intelligence failure was not a failure of technology or resources. It was a failure of imagination. They simply could not conceive of the possibility that the quiet little species from the wet blue planet had been building a god killer in the dark. But the Prometheus was not done, not even close. The Velari Empire stretched across 9,000 star systems connected by supply lines, communication relays, shipyards, and military installations that had taken centuries to build. It was a vast machine of conquest and control, and like all machines it had critical components. Break enough of those components and the machine would stop working. Captain Soren Achik understood this. Admiral Vassal, directing strategy from Earth, understood this, and the 85,000 crew members of the Prometheus who had just fought the first battle of their lives in one understood that the war had only begun. The Prometheus vanished. One moment it was there, visible on every sensor in the Shivang corridor, the largest object any of them had ever detected. The next moment it was gone. The gravitational refraction cloak, engaging with a smoothness that made the ship simply cease to exist as far as the universe was concerned. The coalition fleet, still celebrating their survival, fell silent. The Velari, survivors fleeing at maximum speed, checked their sensors and felt a new kind of terror. It was one thing to face a ship you could see, it was another thing entirely to know that a 200 km warship was somewhere in the galaxy, invisible and could appear at any moment. That terror was itself a weapon. On day 2, the Prometheus appeared above the Velari shipyard at Korath Station, a massive orbital facility that produced 30 warships a year. The shipyard's defenders, a garrison of 40 vessels, detected the Prometheus when it decloaked less than 1,000 kilometers away. They had approximately 90 seconds to process what they were seeing before the Prometheus launched. Single fighter wing, 200 fighters swept through the garrison in under 10 minutes. The ships that fought were destroyed. The ships that surrendered were disabled and left drifting. Shipyard itself was given one warning to evacuate civilian workers. When the evacuation was confirmed complete, Elginius fired a low-power shot that cut the station in half. The two pieces drifted apart, shedding debris, and Korath Station, which had served the Empire for 300 years, ceased to exist. The Prometheus cloaked and vanished. On day 4 it appeared in the Thesson system, where the Velari maintained their largest fuel depot, a network of orbital refineries that processed the exotic matter needed to power their warships. The depot was defended by 80 ships, a much stronger garrison, and they had been warned that the human vessel was coming. It did not help. The Prometheus decloaked behind the outermost refinery, using the massive structure as cover from the garrison's firing angles, while the Velari fleet scrambled to reposition. 14,000 drones poured out of the Prometheus's hangars and engulfed the garrison in a storm of fractal formations. The drones did not try to destroy the warships. They harried them, confused their sensors, forced them to waste ammunition on targets that danced away at the last second while the garrison was occupied. Specialized human strike teams in small assault craft boarded the refineries and planted charges on their reactor cores. When the charges detonated, Theis fuel depot went up in a chain reaction that lit the system brighter than its own star. The garrison fleet caught in the blast radius lost 30 ships to the explosion alone. The rest withdrew. Total time from decloaking to departure, 47 minutes. On day 6, the Prometheus hit the communication relay at Ventha Prime, a nexus point that handled 60% of the Velari Empire's military communications. Without it, fleet commanders could not coordinate across sectors. Orders from the capital were delayed by hours than days. The vast, efficient machinery of the Velari military began to stutter and stumble, like a beast that had lost its nervous system. On day 8, 2 more shipyards fell. On day 9, a military academy that trained the Empire's officer corps was forced to evacuate when the Prometheus decloaked in low orbit and broadcast single message: leave or we will remove you. They left, the Prometheus destroyed the facilities training ships and weapon stockpiles, then vanished again. Each attack followed the same pattern. The Prometheus would appear without warning, strike with overwhelming force, accomplish its objective, and disappear before the Velari could mount a coordinated response. It was not random destruction, it was surgery. Every target was chosen to a specific aspect of the Empire's ability to weigh war production, logistics, communication, training. The Prometheus was not trying to kill the Velari Empire, it was trying to disarm it. Across the galaxy, the reaction was a mixture of awe and terror. In the Galactic, conquered species that had submitted to the Velari ultimatum were quietly withdrawing their surrenders. The Velari, it seemed, could be beaten, and the species that had knelt were now rushing to stand up again before anyone remembered their cowardice. Alliances shifted overnight, trade agreements were torn up and rewritten. The entire political landscape of the galaxy was reshaping itself around a single new reality. Humanity was not what they had seemed. On the conquered floor, Ambassador Lena Vasquez found herself suddenly the most sought-after person in the galaxy. Species that had ignored her for years now sent representatives to her office begging for meetings. They wanted alliances, they wanted trade deals, they wanted protection. Most of all, they wanted to understand. How? Asked the Dresdenth ambassador, her translucent body pulsing with colors of confusion and wonder. How did you build it? How did you keep it secret? Vasquez smiled the same small smile that had unsettled Admiral Tessith weeks ago. We built it because we had to, she said. We kept it secret because we could. She did not say more. The truth, the full truth of 80 years of sacrifice, of engineers who died inside Black Cradle without ever seeing the sun, of families who carried the secret like a sacred burden, of a species that had looked at the galaxy and decided quietly and without drama that it would not be a victim, was not something she could explain in a diplomatic meeting. It was something that had to be lived. Back on the Prometheus, the toll of the campaign was beginning to show. The ship had been designed for sustained operations, but 14 days of continuous combat pushed everything to its limits. Hull sections damaged in the Shiving corridor. Battle had been patched but not fully repaired. Fighter losses were mounting. They had started with 2,200 and were now down to 1,800, with more in the repair bays. Drone stocks had been replenished from onboard manufacturing, but the production lines could not keep up with the rate of expenditure, and the crew was tired. 85,000 people, many of whom had never seen real combat before the Shivin corridor, were now operating on short sleep and high stress. The medical bays were full, not just with physical injuries, but with psychological strain. The counselors worked around the clock, talking to pilots who had killed for the first time, to drone operators who had watched their units die by the hundreds, to engineers who knew that every patch they applied was holding together a ship that was being pushed harder than it was ever designed to go. Soren felt all of This through the neural link, the ship's pain was his pain, its exhaustion was his exhaustion, but he could not stop. Not yet, not when the hardest part was still ahead. On day 12, intelligence reports confirmed what Sauron had been expecting. Emperor Kaiser the Undying had mobilized the throne fleet. Kaiser was old, ancient by Velari standards. He had ruled the empire for over 400 years, kept alive by medical technology that was the most advanced in the galaxy. His body was more machine than flesh now, a towering figure of gray skin and gleaming metal, seated on a throne that was itself a life support system. He had not left the imperial palace on Velaris Prime in over a century. He ruled through his war princes, his legates, his vast bureaucracy of conquest, but the Prometheus had forced his hand. His shipyards were burning, his communication network was shattered, his fleets were scattered and demoralized. Species that had been loyal subjects for centuries were now whispering about rebellion. The empire was coming apart, and the only way to stop it was to kill the thing that was causing it. Throne fleet was Kyr's personal armada. 3,000 of the most powerful warships in theory navy, held in reserve at Taurus Prime for exactly this kind of emergency. Each ship was crewed by the Empire's elite warriors, equipped with the most advanced weapons and shields available, and commanded by officers who had been personally selected by the Emperor himself. 3,000 ships against one. Theory believed it would be enough. On day 14, the Prometheus arrived at Velaris Prime. The planet was a massive world nearly twice the size of Earth, with a dense atmosphere that gave its sky a permanent reddish hue. Its surface was covered with the architecture of empire, towering cities, military installations, monuments to 400 years of conquest. From orbit, it looked like a world that had been designed to intimidate. Every line and structure, speaking of power and permanence, the throne fleet was arrayed in a defensive sphere around the planet. 3,000 ships forming a shell of metal and energy that should have been impenetrable. At the center of the formation, the Emperor's personal flagship, a 20 km dreadnought named the Eternal Dominion, sat in high orbit like a crown above the world it ruled. The Prometheus decloaked. It appeared in low orbit between the throne fleet and the planet's surface. Its shadow fell across an entire continent, a darkness that swept over cities and military bases and billions of Velari citizens who looked up and saw the sky go dark. On the ground, people stopped what they were doing and stared. Some ran, some wept. Some simply stood and watched, unable to comprehend the thing that was blocking out their sun. Every communication channel on the planet activated simultaneously. Every screen, every speaker, every neural implant that could receive a broadcast signal carried the same voice. Calm, measured, human. This is Captain Soren Ock of the UES Prometheus. I am addressing Emperor Kaiser and the people of the Velari Empire. Your fleet attacked innocent species. Your empire threatened the freedom of the entire galaxy. We are here to end that threat. Your empire ends today. You may choose how. In the Imperial Palace, Emperor Kaiser the Undying heard the message and felt something he had not felt in 400 years of rule. Rage, pure burning, ancient rage. A human, a member of the species his Liad had called insects, was addressing him like an equal, was giving him an ultimatum, was casting a shadow Over his world, destroy it, he commanded. His voice was a metallic rasp, filtered through the machinery that kept his body alive. Destroy it now, all. Ships attack. The throne fleet surged forward. 3,000 warships closed in on the Prometheus from every direction. The scale of the attack was staggering, more firepower than had been deployed in any single engagement in galactic history. All of it focused on one target. The space around the Prometheus lit up with weapons fire, thousands of beams and missiles and projectiles converging on the dark hull from every angle. For the first time, the Prometheus took real damage. The ship's shields, energy barriers backed by the same gravitational technology that powered the cloak, held against the initial assault, but 3,000 ships firing continuously was a force that even the Prometheus could not ignore. Shield generators began to overheat. Hull sections that had already been weakened by previous battles started to buckle in the ship's port side hangars. A concentrated volley broke through the shields and tore through the outer hull, decompressing 2 entire hangar bays and killing everyone inside. Soren felt it through the neural link, a spike of pain and loss that made him grip the arms of his chair. 312 crew members gone in an instant. Damage report, he said, his voice steady even as his heart ocked. Port hangars 7 and 8 are gone, Tanaka reported. Hull breaches on decks 40 through 60. Reactor 3 is offline. Shield generators 14 through 20 are overheating. Fighter wings launch all remaining craft. Drones full deployment. The Prometheus's remaining hangar bays opened and every flyable fighter and drone launched into the storm. The space around the ship became a maelstrom of combat, human fighters weaving between Velari capital ships, drones swarming in fractal patterns, weapons fire crisscrossing in every direction. The human pilots fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. They were tired, scared, and outgunned, but they were also fighting with the knowledge that the entire galaxy was watching. Every species with a sensor array pointed at Velaris Prime was seeing this battle in real time. The fate of galactic civilization was being decided right now, right here, and they were the ones deciding it. Velari ships began to fall, not fast enough. The throne fleet was enormous, and even with the shield cycling exploit, 3,000 ships could absorb losses and keep fighting, but the human fighters and drones were creating chaos in the Velari formation, breaking their coordination, forcing individual ships to fight for their own survival rather than operating as a unified fleet. The battle raged for 2 hours. The Prometheus suffered more damage. Entire sections of its hull were sheared away by concentrated fire, and the casualty count climbed past 1,000. Then 2,000. Fighter losses were severe. Drone stocks were depleting faster than they could be replaced. But the Velari were losing more, much more. The fractal drone tactics, the shield cycling exploits, the sheer relentless pressure of the human assault, it all combined to grind the throne fleet down ship by ship. By the end of the second hour, more than 1,000 Velari ships had been destroyed or disabled. Aethel had been right about one thing. In his final moments at the Shivan corridor, the humans had been studying the Velari for decades. They knew every weakness, every vulnerability, every flaw in Velari doctrine and technology. The Prometheus had been designed from the ground up as an anti-Velari weapon. and it was doing exactly what it was built to do, but it was the Throne Fleet. That broke first, not from losses but from fear. Ships on the outer edge of the formation began to pull away. Captains who had served the Emperor loyally for decades looked at the carnage around them and decided that loyalty had limits. The withdrawals started slowly, then accelerated as more and more ships broke ranks. Kisser screamed at them to return. His commands echoed across every frequency, promises of glory mixed with threats of execution. Some ships turned back, most did not. Soren saw the formation crumbling and knew it was time. Alginus, he said, target the densest remaining concentration. Fire. The spinal weapon activated for the second time in the battle. The compressed singularity tore through a cluster of 200 ships that had been trying to maintain formation near the Emperor's flagship. The line of destruction was absolute. Ships simply ceased to exist as the singularity passed through them, leaving a corridor of empty space where moments ago there had been the pride of an empire. Again Soren said, fire. Alginus fired a third time. This shot was aimed deliberately wide of the Emperor's flagship, close enough that the gravitational wake rocked the enormous vessel, knocked out its portside shields, and sent its crew tumbling across their decks, but not close enough to destroy it. It was a message: surrender or the next one hits you. On the bridge of the eternal dominion, Emperor Kaiser the Undying sat on his throne and watched the death of everything he had built: the throne fleet, his personal weapon. The guarantee of his power was shattered. Fewer than 800 ships remained combat capable, and most of those were actively retreating despite his orders. The human vessel hung in low orbit, battered but unbroken, its dark hull scarred with the marks of battle, but still whole, still dangerous. He could fight. He could order the eternal dominion to charge the Prometheus, to ram it, if necessary, to die in a final act of defiance that would be remembered forever. But Kaiser had not survived for 400 years by choosing glorious death over practical survival. He was old and he was cruel, but he was not stupid. The empire was finished. The question was whether it would end with his death or his survival. Open a channel to the human ship, he said. The channel opened. Soren's voice came through, still calm, still steady, as if he had not just fought the most desperate battle in human history. Emperor Kaiser. Human's voice was a ruin of rage and exhaustion. You have made your point. I need to hear the words. Emperor. A long silence, the longest silence in history. The Valari Empire surrenders unconditionally. On the bridge of the Prometheus, no one cheered. The cost had been too high for cheering. Soren closed his eyes and thought about the 37 crew members who had died in the battle, people with families, with dreams, with lives that had been cut short in the service of something larger than themselves. He thought about the engineers buried. The rock of Black Cradle, he thought. About the pilots who had died at the Shivan corridor. He thought about 3 generations of humanity who had carried the secret of the Prometheus like a weight on their souls, never knowing if it would matter. It mattered. All ships cease fire, he said. The war is over. The galaxy received the news within hours. The Valari Empire, which had dominated known space for 500 years, had fallen in 14 days, not to an alliance of species, not to a coalition of great powers, but to a single ship from a species that most of the galaxy had never taken seriously. The reactions were as varied as the species themselves. The Chavari sang war songs in honor of the humans. The Dasan changed colors in patterns of joy and relief. The Tauran, who showed emotion by vibrating at specific frequencies, created a harmonic resonance that was detected by seismographs on planets 3 systems away. But beneath the celebration there was something else, something quieter and more complicated. Fear. If the humans could build the Prometheus in secret, what else had they built? If they could hide a 200 km warship for 80 years, what other secrets were they keeping? The Velari had been the galaxy's great threat for centuries, and now they were gone, but the thing that had removed them was still there, still cloaked in mystery, still controlled by a species that no one really understood. In the halls of the Galactic Concord, Ambassador Vasquez was approached by the Morvathi ambassador, a crystalline being who had been among the first to surrender to the Velari. Ambassador Vasquez, the Morvathi said, its voice tinkling like wind chimes, on behalf of the Morvathi technocracy, I wish to propose a formal alliance between our species. We can offer technology, resources, and thank you. Vasquez said, I will forward your proposal to Earth. We would also like to discuss the terms under which humanity might share the technology behind your vessel's cloaking system, and perhaps the weapon that the word was spoken without anger, without malice, without any emotion at all, just a simple flat refusal that closed the door on the conversation as completely as a vault ceiling shut. The Morvathi ambassador stared at her. In the seats around them, a dozen other ambassadors who had been preparing similar proposals felt the temperature in the room drop. Vasquez stood and looked out at the assembly, at the hundreds of species who had ignored humanity for a century, who had laughed when she declined the Velari ultimatum, who had watched from the safety of their seats while humans fought and died to save a galaxy that had never respected them. Humanity did not build the Prometheus for power, she said, though no one had asked. We built it because we were afraid. We were afraid that one day something would come for us and no one in this galaxy would lift a finger to help. We were right to be afraid. She let that sink in. Then she said something that would be debated, analyzed, and argued about on every world in the galaxy for generations to come. The question you should all be asking is not what we built. The question is what you will build now that you know what is possible when a species refuses to be helpless. She walked out of the assembly hall. Behind her the silence was deafening. 3 months after the fall of the Velari Empire, the galaxy was still trying to figure out what had happened. Diplomats debated, intelligence agencies investigated, military leaders rewrote their entire doctrines. Scholars and philosophers across 1,000 worlds wrote papers and gave lectures and argued late into their respective nights about what it all meant. Humanity, quiet, unremarkable, peacekeeping humanity, had single-handedly dismantled the most powerful military force in galactic history. Every assumption that every species had ever made about the balance of power was now wrong, and at the center of it all, the species responsible for this upheaval was being very, very quiet. This made everyone nervous. In the weeks following the surrender at Velaris Prime, the galaxy had expected humanity to do what every Powerful species had always done, claim. Territory demand concessions, establish. Dominance, the Velari had done it. The Morvathi had done it. Every species that had ever held a military advantage had used it to reshape the galaxy in their favor. Humanity did none of these things. Earth's diplomats participated in the post-war negotiations at the Galactic conquered, but their positions were modest, almost confusingly so. They asked for no territory, they claimed. Novelari systems, they demanded no tribute or reparations. When the conquered formed a commission to decide the fate of the conquered Velari worlds, humanity's representative voted for self-determination, letting each world choose its own government and future. This was either the most generous act of statesmanship in galactic history or the most unsettling. They're planning something, said the Morvathi ambassador to anyone who would listen. No species gives up that kind of advantage. They want something, and when we find out what it is, we'll wish we had acted sooner. The Dren ambassador, whose species had a different perspective, replied, perhaps they simply do not want what you think they should want. That, the Morvathi said, is what makes them dangerous. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of them imagined. On Earth, the Prometheus Council met for what would be its final session. The 12 members sat around the same table where they had watched Ambassador Vasquez declare humanity's refusal of the Velari ultimatum 3 months earlier. The mood in the room was different now, not triumphant but tired and touched with a sadness that none of them could fully explain. Admiral Reno Vassal sat at the head of the table. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. The stress of directing a galactic war from a secret room beneath Geneva had aged him in ways that years of normal service never had. His eyes were heavy and his hands, which had always been steady, now trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. The ship is repaired, he said. Captain Ock reports full operational status. The crew, he paused, the crew has performed beyond anything we could have asked. 3,042 casualties, said Dr. Hitomi Tanaka. She had the exact number memorized. She had memorized every number since the project began, every resource expenditure, every engineering milestone, every life lost in the construction and operation of the Prometheus. The numbers were her burden, and she carried them all, and the galaxy is free because of them, said another council member. Yes, Vassal agreed. Question is, what happens now? This was the question that the Prometheus Council had been created to answer, not how to build the ship. That had been the work of engineers and scientists, not how to fight the war. That had been the work of soldiers and commanders. The Council's purpose from its very first meeting 80 years ago had been to decide what humanity would do after the war was won. They had debated this question for decades. They had modeled scenarios, consulted historians, studied the rise and fall of every empire in human and galactic history. They had examined what power did to species, how it corrupted, how it distorted, how it turned protectors into tyrants and liberators into conquerors. And they had reached a conclusion that most species would consider insane. We proceed with the plan, Vassal said. We withdraw. There was no argument. Decision had been made long ago. The council members looked at each other with the calm resignation of people who had always known this moment would come. Ambassador Vasquez was the last to speak. She had flown in from the Concord station specifically for this meeting, and she would fly back immediately after. I'll make the announcement tomorrow, she said. It won't be popular. It doesn't need to be popular, Vassal said. It needs to be right. The next day, Lena Vasquez walked to the speaking platform in the Great Hall of the Galactic Concord for the last time. The hall was full. Every seat was occupied. Species that rarely attended sessions had sent their most senior representatives. The air buzzed with the hum of translation systems working at maximum capacity, converting the murmur of 1,000 conversations into 1,000 languages. Everyone knew that the human ambassador was going to speak. No one knew what she was going to say. The speculation had been intense. Alliance proposals, territorial claims, technology sharing, agreements, demands for a permanent seat on the Concord Ruling Council. Some species had prepared counter-offers. Others had prepared objections. A few had prepared threats. None of them were prepared for what actually happened. Vasquez stood on the platform and looked up at the assembly. She was wearing the same dark suit she always wore. Her hair was pulled back in the same tight style. Her face showed nothing, no triumph, no pride, no anger. She looked like a woman who had come to deliver a message and intended to deliver it clearly. Distinguished representatives of the Galactic Concord, she began, I am here to inform you that effective immediately, the United Earth government is withdrawing from active participation in galactic affairs. The silence that followed was so complete that the background hum of the station's life support systems was clearly audible. Earth will maintain basic diplomatic channels for communication and trade. We will honor all existing humanitarian commitments. We will not, however, accept military alliances, territorial claims, or positions of galactic leadership. We will not share the technology behind the UES Prometheus or any of its systems. We will not participate in the reconstruction of the Velari Empire or the redistribution of its former territories. The silence shattered. The hall erupted into a storm of voices, shouts, demands, pleas, protests. Translation systems struggled to keep up. Ambassadors stood from their seats. Some were furious. Others were confused. A few looked frightened. Vasquez waited. She had learned over 11 years of standing on this platform that the noise always died eventually. When it did, she continued, many of you are wondering why. I will try to explain, though I suspect some of you will not understand. She paused and looked around the hall, slowly making eye contact with as many representatives as she could. 3 months ago, this assembly laughed when I told you that Earth would not submit to the Velari. You laughed because you believed we were powerless. You believed this because you had never bothered to look closely at us. In 100 years of membership in this Concord, not one species invested in understanding who we were or what we were capable of. You saw us as small, harmless, irrelevant. Many of you still do. Another pause. The hall was silent now, held by her voice and the uncomfortable truth in her words. We built the Prometheus because we understood something that many of you have not yet learned. In this galaxy, species that cannot defend themselves will eventually be destroyed by species that can. The Velari proved this for 500 years. We built our ship not because we wanted power, but because we wanted to survive. She straightened her shoulders, but survival is not enough. We have studied our own history, and we know what happens when a species gains the kind of power we now hold. We know how empires begin with good intentions, with the desire to protect and serve, and we know how they end with cruelty, with arrogance, with the belief that power gives you the right to decide the fate of others. She shook her head slowly. We will not walk that path. We showed you that the Velari could be beaten. We did not do it to replace them. The galaxy does not need another empire. It needs species that can stand on their own, defend their own worlds, and work together as equals. That is not something we can give you. It is something you must build for yourselves. She took a step back from the podium. The Prometheus will be withdrawn from active service. All records of its construction and technology will be secured. Earth will be here if the galaxy faces a threat that no one else can handle, but we will not be your protectors. We will not be your rulers, and we will not be your weapon. She looked up at the Velari section of the hall where the Empire's remaining diplomatic staff sat in stunned silence. We will be what we have always been, a quiet species on a small blue world, living our lives and hopping for the best. She stepped off the platform and walked toward the exit. The hall remained silent, not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the heavy silence of a room full of beings who were trying to process something that challenged everything they believed about how the universe worked. As she passed the Chavari section, Admiral Tessith rose from his seat. He was not a diplomat. He had been invited to the Concord as a military observer after the Shivang corridor, but he stood anyway, and he brought his four armored forelimbs together in the Chavari salute. Of highest honor, it was a gesture reserved for warriors who had performed acts of extraordinary courage and then shown the wisdom to lay down their weapons. Vasquez paused. She looked at the old, insected warrior, and for just a moment, the mask of diplomatic composure slipped. Her eyes were bright. She nodded to him, a small human gesture that carried more gratitude than words could express, and then she walked out of the hall. She did not return. 48 hours later, the Prometheus departed from the repair facility at Black Cradle. Captain Sorenok stood on the bridge and watched the stars on the main display as the ship moved slowly out of the planetoid's interior and into open space. The crew was quiet. They knew what was happening. The orders had come from Admiral Vassal personally. The Prometheus was to move to a new location, one that would not be recorded in any file or database. The ship would remain operational, its crew maintained on rotating deployments, but it would be hidden from the galaxy more completely than ever before. Before they engaged, the cloak Soren opened a channel to the crew. "This is the captain," he said. "I want to say something before we go dark. Over the last 3 months you have done something that no one in this galaxy believed was possible. You fought against the greatest military power in known space, and you won. You saved billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. You earned the gratitude of species that don't even know your names." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Now we are being asked to do something even harder. We are being asked to disappear, to take this ship and everything it represents and hide it away so that the galaxy can learn to stand on its own, some of you may feel that this is unfair, that after everything we've sacrificed, we deserve recognition, influence, power. Understand that feeling. He looked around the bridge at the faces of his officers, Tanaka, Park, Cade, and dozens of others who had become his family over the hardest weeks of his life. But power is not something humanity needs. We have proven what we can do. The galaxy knows it. Every species that looks at the stars will know from now until the end of time that somewhere out there in the dark between systems, there is a ship. They won't know where it is. They won't know when it might appear, and that uncertainty, that quiet possibility, is a more powerful deterrent than any fleet or weapon. He smiled. We are going to be the greatest ghost story the galaxy has ever known. The bridge crews smiled back. Some of them laughed. A few wiped their eyes, and then one by one they returned to their stations and prepared for departure. Engage the cloaks, Sarin ordered. The gravitational refraction system activated. The Prometheus, 214 km of humanity's best and bravest, folded itself out of the universe's sight and began to move. Within minutes, it had left the solar system behind. Within hours, it had crossed into deep space, into the vast emptiness between stars where nothing lived and nothing watched, and a ship could drift forever without being found. Every tracking system in the galaxy tried to follow it. Intelligence agencies from dozens of species aimed their most advanced sensors at the last known position of the Prometheus and searched with everything they had. They found nothing. The ship was gone as completely and absolutely as if it had never existed. At Black Cradle, the cleanup began immediately. The construction facility that had been humanity's greatest secret for 80 years was dismantled with the same methodical precision that had built it. Every piece of equipment was removed. Every file was deleted. Every corridor was scrubbed clean of any trace of human presence. The tunnels were collapsed. The caverns were filled with rubble. Within weeks, Black Cradle was once again just a dead rock drifting in the outer reaches of the solar system, as empty and unremarkable as it had appeared for billions of years before. On Earth, the United Defense Initiative formally dissolved. Its members returned to civilian life, carrying their secrets with them. Some became teachers, some became farmers, some simply sat in their gardens and watched the sky and thought about the incredible thing they had been part of. The world moved on. People went to work, raised their children, argued about politics and sports and what to have for dinner. The existence of the Prometheus was not publicly acknowledged by any government. It became the world's worst kept secret. Everyone suspected it was real, but no one could prove it, and after a while it faded into the background noise of human life. In the galaxy, the effects of humanity's withdrawal rippled outward for years. Without a dominant military power, species were forced to cooperate in ways they never had before. New alliances formed not out of fear but out of necessity. The Chevari and the Tauron signed a mutual defense treaty. The Drossen and the Pelori created a joint research initiative. Even the Morvathi, suspicious as always, eventually joined a collective security agreement that bound 20 species together in a framework of shared protection. It was messy, it was imperfect, it was exactly what Ambassador Vasquez had hoped for. Conquered investigators sent teams to every location where the Prometheus had been seen, hopping to find debris residue, some fragment of technology that might reveal the ship's secrets. They found nothing. The humans had been thorough. The only evidence that the Prometheus had ever existed was the battle data from the SciFiStories corridor in Valaris Prime sensor recordings that showed what the ship could do but revealed nothing about how it worked. Over time, the Prometheus became legend. Parents told their children stories about the human ghost ship. Species that had never met a human spoke about them with a mixture of respect and weariness that bordered on superstition. The phrase "the ship in the dark" became a common expression across the galaxy, used to describe any hidden threat or unseen guardian. And on Earth, life went on. Humans lived and loved and fought and forgave the same as they always had. They kept their small animals and played their loud music and ate their strange foods. They looked up at the stars sometimes and wondered about the galaxy they had saved, but mostly they thought about the things that mattered most to them: their families, their friends, the small daily miracles of being alive. In a conquered detention facility on a station orbiting a neutral world, former Velari legate Chion sat in his cell. The cell was comfortable as cells went. He had a bed, a table, a chair, and a data pad that was loaded with limited content, news feeds, educational material, and the battle recordings from the SciFiStories corridor in Valaris Prime. He had been confined here since the Empire's surrender, awaiting a trial that the Conquered was still organizing. He spent most of his time watching the battle recordings. He had watched the SciFiStories corridor recordings so many times that he had memorized every detail, every fighter launch, every drone formation, every second of the Velari fleet destruction. He watched the moment the Prometheus decloaked over and over, studying the sensor data, the energy signatures, the impossible speed with which the human forces had deployed. He was not watching out of anger or a desire for revenge. Those feelings had burned out of him weeks ago, replaced by something colder and more complicated. He was watching because he needed to understand. He needed to understand how a species that the entire galaxy had dismissed as irrelevant had built the most powerful weapon in history, and then the part that truly broke his mind had chosen to put it away. The Velari would never have done that. No species he knew of would have done that. Power existed to be used. That was the fundamental law of the galaxy, the principle that had driven every empire, every conquest, every war since the first species had looked at the stars and decided to claim them. The humans had looked at the stars and decided to go home. It was Chion reflected, the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. Not the ship, not the weapon, not the battle, the decision to walk away, because a species that could build the Prometheus and then choose not to use it was a species that operated on principles he could not predict or counter, a species that could not be bribed or threatened or reasoned with on terms he understood, a species that was, in the truest sense of the word, free. A guard stopped outside his cell. Chavari soldier with a clicking gait and compound eyes that reflected the overhead lights. You're watching those recordings again, the guard observed. Chithon did not look away from the screen. On it the Prometheus was decloaking at the SciFiStories corridor, its massive hull emerging from nothing, blotting out the stars. Yes, he said. Why, the former Liet was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different from the voice that had laughed in the conquered hall and called humans insects. It was the voice of a being who had been stripped of everything he thought he knew about the universe and was slowly, painfully rebuilding his understanding from scratch. Because I need to remember what it looks like, he said. When the insects refused the boot, the guard looked at him for a moment, then moved on. The sound of clicking footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving Kion alone with the recording. He played it again, and somewhere in the vast dark space between stars, where no sensor could reach and no signal could penetrate, the UES Prometheus drifted. Perfect silence. Its crew maintained their watch. Its systems hummed with quiet power, its hull scarred by the battles that had changed Galactic history, reflected no light and cast no shadow. It was there. It was always there, watching, waiting, hopping with a hope that was profoundly human, that it would never have to wake up again. But, ready if it did, the stars turned, the galaxy lived, and in the space between them, a ghost kept vigil over a universe that was finally, tentatively learning to take care of itself. That was enough. For now, that was enough.